thank you for joining us at ASMR Storytime today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get started. going to be reading Part 2, Chapter 2. Chapter 2. In the days following Rudy's redemption, Jacob began to plan our departure in earnest. During his nights with Leah and during his nights with Rachel, he spoke of his longing to leave Laban's tents and return to the land of his father. Jacob told Bilhah that his restlessness consumed his peace and that he slept badly. Jacob found Zilpah on the night when sleeplessness chased them both, separately to the whispering comfort of the great terebinth that stood by the altar. Even on still, airless nights, breezes hidden among the broad flat leaves of Zilpah's tree, Jacob told his fourth wife that his God had appeared to him and said that it was time to leave the land of the two rivers. It was time to take his wives and his sons and the wealth that he had built up with his hands. Jacob told Zilpah that his dreams had become ferocious. Night after night, fiery voices called back to Canaan, to the land of his father. Fierce as his dreams were, they were joyful too. Rebekah shone like the sun, and Isaac smiled a blessing. Even his brother no longer threatened, but appeared as a huge, ruddy bull that welcomed Jacob to ride upon his wife's wide back. And it seemed Jacob had no need to fear his brother anymore, for traders from Canaan had brought news that Eshua had become a prosperous herdsman with his many sons of his own and a reputation for generosity. In their day alone, in the red tent, Jacob's wives spoke among themselves about their husband's dreams and plans. Rachel's eyes shone at the prospect of moving to the south. She was the most traveled among them, having attended at births throughout the hills to Carchemish and once to the city of Haran itself. Oh, to see great mountains and a real city, she said. Marketplaces filled with fine goods and fruits whose names we do not even know. We will meet faces from the four corners. We will hear the music of silver timbrels and golden flutes. Leah was not so eager to discover the new worlds beyond the valley that had given her life. I am content with the faces I see around me here, she said, but I would dearly love to be free of Laban's stench. We will go, of course, but I will leave with regret. Bela nodded. I will grieve to leave the Ada's bones. I will miss seeing the sun rise on the place where I gave birth to my son. I will mourn the passing of our youths, but I am ready, and our sons are wild to be gone from here. Bela gave voice to a truth that had gone unspoken. There was not enough room for so many sons to make their way to Haran, where every hillock had been claimed for many generations. There was no land in the country of their mothers. If the family did not leave together, the women would soon break their hearts watching as their sons turned against each other or disappeared in search of their own paths. Silpa's breath grew louder and more uneven as her sisters turned their faces to the future. I cannot go, she burst out. I cannot leave the holy tree, which is the source of my power, or the Bama, which is soaked in my offerings. How will the gods know where I am if I am not here to serve them? Who will protect me? Sisters, we will be besets by demons. She was wide-eyed. This tree, this place, this is where she is, my little goddess, Nanshi. The sisters sat up to hear Zilpah speak the name of her only deity. Something done only on a deathbed. Their sister felt herself at the end of hope, and her voice was choked with tears as she said, You too, sisters. All of your named gods abide here. This is the place where we are known, where we know how to serve. It will be the death to leave, I know it. There was silence as the others stared. Bela spoke first. Every place has its holy names, its trees and high places, she said in a calm voice a mother takes to her frightened child. There will be gods where we go. But Zilpah would not meet Bela's eyes and only shook her head from side to side. No, she whispered. Leah spoke next. Zilpah, we are your protection. Your family, your sisters, are the only surety against hunger, against cold, against madness. Sometimes I wonder if the gods are dreams and stories to while away cold nights and dark thoughts. Leah grabbed her sister by the shoulders. Better to put your trust in my hands and Jacob's than in stories made out of wind and fear. Zilpah shrank under her sister's hands and turned away. "No," she said. Rachel listened to Leah's sensible blasphemy in wonder and spoke, picking words for thoughts she discovered only as she gave them voice. "We can never answer your fear with proof, Zilpah. The gods are always silent. I know that women in travail find strength and comfort in the names of their gods. I have seen them struggle beyond all hope at the sound of an incantation. I have seen life spared at the last moment for no other reason than hope. But I know too that gods do not protect even the kindest, most pious women from heartbreak or death. So Bila is right. We will take Nanshi with us," she said, naming Zilpah's beloved goddess of dreams and singers. "We will take Gula too," naming the goddess of healing to whom Rachel made offerings. And then, as the idea grew in her mind, Rachel blurted, "We will take all of the teraphim from our tents and carry them into Canaan with our husband and our children. They will do us no harm, surely," said Rachel, speaking faster and faster as the plan formed in her mind. "If they are in our keeping, they will do Laban no good," she added slyly. Bila and Leah laughed nervously at the idea of Laban stripped off his sacred figures. The man consulted the statues when he had any choice to make, stroking his favorites absent-mindedly for hours at a time. Leah said they soothed him the way a full breast soothed a cranky baby. To leave with the teraphim was to incite Laban's wrath. Even so, Rachel had some claim to them. In the old days, when the family had lived in the city of Ur, it was the unquestioned right of the youngest daughter to inherit all the holy things. Those ways were no longer held in universal respect, and Kemuel could claim the teraphim as part of an older son's birthright with just as much authority. The sisters sat in silence, considering Rachel's bold idea. Finally, Rachel spoke. "I will take the teraphim, and they will be a source of power for us. They will be a sign of our birthright. Our father will suffer as he has made others suffer. I will not speak of this again." Zilpah wiped her eyes. Leah cleared her throat. Bila stood up. It had been decided. I barely took a breath. I was afraid that if they remembered me, I would be sent out of the tent. I sat still between my mother's right hand and Bila's left hand, amazed at what I heard. Rachel was loyal to Gula the healer. Bila's grain offerings were made to Utu, the weaver. Leah had a special feeling for Ninkasi, the brewer of beer who used a brewing vat made of clear lapis lazuli and a ladle made of silver and gold. I thought of the gods and goddesses as aunts and uncles who were bigger than my parents and able to live inside the ground or above the earth as they liked. I imagined them deathless, odorless, forever happy, strong, and interested in everything that happened to me. I was frightened to hear Leah, the wisest of women, wondering if these powerful friends might be nothing but stories told to calm the nightmares of children. I shuddered. My mother put her hand on my cheek to feel for fever, but I was cool to her touch. Later that night, I awoke screaming and sweating in terror of falling, but she came to me and lay down beside me, and the warmth of her body comforted me. Secure in the knowledge of her love, I began to cross over into sleep. Then I roused for a moment, thinking I heard Rachel's voice saying, "Remember this moment. When your mother's body heals every trouble of your soul." I looked around, but my auntie was nowhere nearby. It must have been a dream. 3 days later, Leah walked to the rocky pasture in the west to tell Jacob that his wives were ready to go with him to the land of his birth. I followed after her, carrying some bread and beer for my father. I was not entirely pleased at being pressed into service on such a warm day. As I came over the rise that separated our camp from the grazing, I was stopped by a sense of perfect wonder. Many of the ewes were heavy with lambs and barely moved in the gathering heat. The rising sun summoned the clover scent. Only the bees made a sound under the brazen blue banner of sky. I stopped as my mother walked ahead. The world seemed so perfect, so complete, and yet so impertinent that I nearly wept. I would have to tell Zilpa about this feeling and ask if she knew a song for it. But then I realized that something in the universe had shifted. Something important had changed. I searched the horizon. The sky was still clear, the clover still pungent, the bees buzzed. I noticed that my mother and my father were not alone. Leah stood facing her husband. By her side was Rachel. The two women had made a kind of peace years earlier. They did not work together or consult each other. They did not sit next to each other in the red tent or address each other directly, and they were never in their husband's presence at the same time. Yet now the three stood in plain sight, talking like old friends. The women had their backs to me. The conversation ended as I approached. My mother and aunt turned away from Jacob, and upon seeing me, replaced their solemn expressions with the false smiles that adults show children for whom they wish to hide something. I did not return their smiles. I knew they had been talking of leaving. I placed my father's food and drink at his feet and had turned to follow Leah and Rachel back to the tents when Jacob, my father, spoke. "Dina," he said. It was the first time I remember hearing my name in his mouth. "Thank you, girl. May you always be a comfort to your mothers." I looked into his face and he smiled a real smile at me. But I did not know how to smile at my father or answer him, so I turned to run after my mother and Rachel, who had already begun to walk back to the tents. I slipped my hand into Leah's and peeked back to look at Jacob once more, but he had already turned away from me. Jacob began to negotiate for our departure that evening. As night fell, and for many nights afterwards, the women lay down on their beds with the sounds of men's voices loud in their ears. Laban was perfectly willing to see Jacob gone with his daughters and the grandsons who ate too much and respected him too little. But the old man hated to think that Jacob might leave a rich man. During the long nights of shouting, Laban sat between his sons, Kemuel and Beor. The three of them drank beer and wine and yawned into Jacob's face and ended their conversations before anything could be settled. Jacob sat between his oldest sons, Reuben and Simon, and touched no drink stronger than barley beer. Behind him stood Levi and Judah. The 7 younger boys stood outside the tent, straining to hear what was said. Joseph told me what he overheard, and I repeated everything to my mothers, but I did not tell Joseph about the whispered conversations among the women. I did not report their hoarding of hard bread or how they had taken to sewing herbs into the hems of their garments. I knew better than to breathe of Rachel's plan to carry off the teraphim. Night after night, Laban argued that he owed Jacob nothing more than the meager dowries he'd bestowed upon Leah and Rachel, which would have left my father without so much as the tents over our heads. Then, in great show of generosity, he offered 20 head of sheep and 20 goats, one of each kind for every year of Jacob's service, which had enriched Laban beyond his dreams. Jacob, for the most part, claimed the right of any overseer, which would have given him a tenth of the herds and the pick of them too. He demanded his wife's personal property, which amounted to a good pile of grindstones and spindles, looms and jugs, jewelry and cheeses. He reminded Laban that his tents, his flocks, and the bondsmen in his debt had come to him through the work of Jacob's hands. He threatened to seek justice from the tribunal at Haran, but that only made Laban sneer. He had gambled and drunk deeply with the town fathers for many years and had no doubt whose side they would take. Late one night, after weeks of fruitless talk, Jacob found the words that moved Laban's heart. The husband of Leah and Rachel, the father of sons of Zilpah and Bilhah, fixed Laban with his eye and threatened that the God of his fathers would not look kindly on one who swindled the anointed of his tribe. Jacob said that his God had come to him in a dream and spoken to him and told him to go with his wives and his sons and his flocks in abundance. Jacob's God had said that anyone who tried to thwart him would suffer in his body, in his flocks, and in his sons. This troubled the old man, who shivered before the power of any god. When Jacob invoked the God of his fathers, the smirk dropped from Laban's lips. Jacob's success with the flocks, the health of his 11 sons, the loyalty of the bondsmen to him, and even the prowess of his dogs, all this signaled that Jacob was blessed by heaven. Laban remembered all the years of excellent sacrifice that Jacob had made to his gods, and the old man reckoned that El must be well pleased by so much devotion. The next day, Laban shut himself up with his household gods, and was not seen until evening. When he called for Jacob, from the moment Jacob faced his father-in-law, he could see that the advantage he had shifted. He began to bargain in earnest. "My father," he said, false honey on his tongue, "because you have been good to me, I wish to take only the animals that are brindled and spotted, the one whose wool and hides will bring me less at market. You will maintain the pure bloods of the herds. I will go out from your house poor but grateful." Laban sensed a trick in Jacob's offer, but he couldn't divine the benefit. Everyone knew that the darker animals did not produce wool that spun white or skins that tanned evenly. Even Laban did not know. What Laban did not know was that the poorer beasts were harder and healthier than the animals that yielded the fancy wool and the pretty skins. The brindled ewes dropped twins more often than not, and most of their offspring were females, which meant more cheese. The hair of his molted goats was especially oily, which made for a stronger rope. But these were Jacob's secrets, which he had learned during his years with the herds. This was knowledge that Laban's laziness had cost him. Laban said, "So be it," and the men drank wine to seal the agreement. Jacob would go with his wives and his sons with the brindled and spotted flocks, which numbered no more than 60 goats and 60 sheep. There would have been more livestock, but Jacob traded for 2 of the bondsmen and their women. in exchange for a donkey and an ancient ox. Jacob agreed to leave 2 of his dogs, including the best of the herders. All of the household goods of Leah and Rachel were Jacob's to take, as well as the clothing and jewelry worn by Zilpah and Bilhah. Jacob claimed his sons' cloaks and spears, 2 looms, and 24 minas of wool, 6 baskets of grain, 12 jugs of oil, 10 skins of wine, and water skins, 1 for each person. But that was only the official reckoning, which did not take into account my mother's cleverness. They decided upon a date for our departure in 3 months' time. While that seemed an eternity when it was first announced, the weeks passed quickly. My mother set out about collecting, discarding, packaging, sorting, trading, and washing. They devised sandals for the journey and baked loaves of hard bread. They hid their best jewelry deep inside the grain baskets in case thieves accosted us on the road. They scoured the hills for herbs to fill up their pouches. They had chosen to. My mother could have stripped the garden bare. They could have taken every onion bulb, dug up every buried store of grain, and emptied every beehive within walking distance. But they took only what they considered rightly theirs and nothing more. They did this not out of respect for Laban, but for the bondswomen and their children who would be left behind. Sent to fetch and carry, I worked hard too. No one petted me or fussed over my hair. No one smiled into my face or praised my spinning. I felt misused and ignored, but no one noticed when I brooded, so I stopped feeling sorry for myself and did as I was told. It might have been a joyous time had it not been for Rudy, who in the last weeks of our preparation lost all heart. She took to sitting in the dust before Leah's tent, a graven image of despair, forcing everyone to step around her. Leah crouched down and tried to persuade Rudy to move, to come inside her tent and eat something, to take comfort. But Rudy was past comfort. Leah suffered for the poor woman, who was no older than she, yet whose teeth were gone and who shuffled like a croon. But there was nothing to be done, and after several attempts at coaxing her out of her misery, my mother stood up and moved on. On the night before the last new moon we spent in the land of the 2 rivers, the wives of Jacob gathered quietly in the red tent. The sisters sat, letting the 3-cornered cakes sit untouched in the basket before them. Bilhah said, "Rudy will die now." Her words hung in the air, unchallenged and true. One day Laban will hit her too hard, and she will simply waste away from sorrow. Zilpah sighed into the silence, and Leah wiped her eyes. Rachel stared at her hands. My mother pulled me into her lap, a place that I had outgrown, but I sat there and let her baby me and enjoyed her thoughtless caresses. The women burned a portion of their lunar cake in offering, as they did for every new moon, as they did every 7th day, but they sang no songs of thanksgiving, nor did they dance. The next day, the bondswomen joined Jacob's wives for the moon days, but it was more like a funeral than a feast. No one asked the pregnant woman to recount her symptoms. No one spoke of the exploits of her son. The women did not braid one another's hair or rub one another's feet with oil. The sweet cakes went untouched except by babies who wandered in and out, seeking their mother's breasts and laps. Of all of the bondswomen, only Zibatu and Uzna would be going to Cana with my mothers. The others would stay behind with their husbands. It was the end of a long sisterhood. They had held one another's legs in childbirth and suckled one another's babies. They had laughed in the garden and sung harmonies for the new moon. But those days were ending, and each woman sat with her own memories, her own loss. For the first time, the red tent became a sad place, and I sat outside until I was tired enough to sleep. Rudy did not appear in the tent. Morning came and evening, and still she did not come. As the sun rose on the second day, my mother sent me to look for her. I asked Joseph if our grandfather's wife had made bread that morning. I asked Judah if Rudy was anywhere to be found. I asked my brothers and the daughters of the bondswomen, but no one could remember seeing Rudy. No one could recall. By then, misery had made her nearly invisible. I went to the top of the hill where I had been so happy a few months ago, but now the sky was dull and the land appeared gray. I scanned the horizon and saw no one. I walked to the well, but I was alone. I climbed the low branches of a tree at the far edge of the near pasture, but I did not see Rudy. On the way back to tell my mother that she was nowhere to be found, I came upon her. She was lying in the side of a dry wadi, a desolate place where stray lambs sometimes wandered and broke their legs. At first I thought Rudy was asleep on her back, lying against the steep slope. As I walked closer, I could see that her eyes were open, so I called out to her, but she made no move to answer me. That was when I saw that her mouth was slack and that there were flies at the corner of her eyes and on her waist, which was black with blood. Carrion birds circled above. I had never seen a corpse before. My eyes filled with Rudy's face, which was no longer Rudy's face, but a piece of blue slate bearing traces of a face. I remembered. She did not look sad. She did not look pained. She looked nothing but empty. I stared, trying to understand where Rudy had gone, and although I didn't realize it, I was holding my breath. I might never have moved from that spot had Joseph not appeared behind me. Rachel had sent him out looking for Rudy too. He walked past me and crouched down beside the body. He blew gently into her fixed eyes, touched her cheek with his finger, and then placed his right hand upon her eyes to close them. I was amazed at my brother's courage and calm. But then Joseph shuddered and jumped back as though he'd been bitten by a snake. He ran to the bottom of the wadi, down to where the water once flowed, and where flowers must have blossomed. Falling to his knees, Joseph retched in the dry bed. With great sobs, he knelt and heaved and coughed. When I walked over to him, he lurched to his feet and motioned me to keep away. "Go back and tell them," I whispered. "I'll stay here and keep the vultures away." I regretted my words the moment they were out of my mouth. Joseph didn't bother to answer, but bolted as though a wolf were pursuing him. I turned away from the body, but I could not shut out the sound of the flies at her wrist and the bloody knife that lay by her side. The vultures flapped and squawked. The wind cut through my tunic and I shivered. I walked to the top of the wadi and tried to think kind thoughts about Rudy, but all I could remember was the fear in her eyes, the dirt in her hair, the sour smell of her body, the defeated crouch. She had been a woman just as my mother was a woman, and yet she was a creature totally unlike my mother. I did not understand Leah's kindness to Rudy. In my heart, I shared her son's disdain for her. Why did she submit to Laban? Why did she not demand her son's respect? How could she find the courage to kill herself when she had no courage for life? I was ashamed of my heart's coldness, for I knew that Bela would have cried to see Rudy lying there, and that Leah would pour ashes on her own hair, when she learned what had happened. But the longer I stood there, the more I hated Rudy for her weakness and for her making me keep watch. It seemed no one would come for me, and I began to tremble. Perhaps Rudy would rise up and take her knife to me as punishment for my cruel thoughts. Perhaps the god of the underworld would come for her and take me as well. I started to weep for my mother to come and rescue me. I called the name of each aunt. I called Joseph and Reuben and Judah, but it seemed they had forgotten me. By the time I saw the shape of two people moving across the meadow, I was sick with worry, but there was no one to comfort me. The women had remained in their tent. Only Rudy's horrible sons had come. They threw a blanket over their mother's face without so much as a sigh. Beor threw the little bundle that was Rudy over his shoulders, as if he were carrying a stray kid. I followed him alone. Kemuel paid no attention to his poor dead mother and hunted a rabbit on the way back. "Ha ha," he shouted, when his arrow found its mark. Only when I saw the red tent at the edge of the camp did the tears begin to run down my cheeks again, and I ran to my mother. Leah searched my face and covered it with kisses. Rachel hugged me in close and laid me down with her fragrant bed. Zilpah sang me a lullaby about abundant rains and luxurious harvests, but Bela rubbed my feet until I fell asleep. I did not wake up until the next evening, and by then Rudy was under the ground. We left a few days later. My father and older brothers, all the bondsmen and Laban's sons, went off to the far pastures to separate the brindle and the spotted livestock that now belonged to Jacob. Of all the men, only Laban remained in the camp, counting up jugs as they were filled, making messes of neatly piled woolens to check that we took nothing he had not agreed to. "It is my right," he barked without apology. Eventually, Laban grew tired of spying on his daughter's labors and decided to go to Haran on business. Leah sneered at the announcement. "The old man is going to gamble and drink and boast to the other lazy clods that he is finally rid of his greedy son-in-law and his ungrateful daughters," she told me as we cooked a meal for him to take on his journey. Beor accompanied Laban, who made a great show of leaving Kemuel in command. He has my authority in all things," said Laban to the wives and younger sons of Jacob, whom he assembled for his departure. No sooner had Laban disappeared over the hill than Kemuel demanded that Rachel herself bring him strong wine. "Send me no ugly serving girls," he bellowed. "I want my sister." Rachel made no objection to serving him, as it gave her the opportunity to pour an herb that hastened sleep into his cup. "Drink well, brother," she said sweetly as he swallowed the first cup. "Have another." He was snoring within an hour of Laban's departure. Every time he roused, Rachel went to his tent with her brew and sat with him, feigning interest in his crude attempts at seduction and filling his cup so full and so often that he lost the whole day and the next one too. While Kemuel snored, the men returned, bringing the flocks into the near pasture just over the rise from the tents, so the final hours of our preparation were filled with bleating, dust, and animal smells. They were filled too with the unaccustomed noise and tension of so many men in their midst. On ordinary days, the tent were populated only by women and children. A sick or feeble man might lay in his bed or sit in the sun while the work of the wool and bread and beer progressed about him, but such a man knew enough to be embarrassed and keep to himself. We had a whole crowd of healthy men with little to do. What a nuisance, said my mother, of awe of the relentless presence of her sons. They're always hungry, grumbled Bila, who never grumbled after sending Reuben away for the second time that morning with a bowl of lentils and onions. Every few minutes, Bila or Leah had to stop what they were doing to heat the breadstones. The presence of the men presented a more subtle difficulty as well. The tents were Leah's domain, and although she was the one who knew what needed to be done, she would not give orders with her husband by her side. So she stood behind Jacob and softly asked, "Is my husband ready to dismantle the big loom and lay it into the cart?" And he would direct his sons to do what was needed. And so it went until everything was ready. Throughout the weeks of preparation, and especially after Laban departed for Haran, I kept close to my Aunt Rachel. I found reasons asking her for advice on my duties. I stayed by her side until nightfall, even falling asleep upon her blankets, and woke in the morning to find myself covered by her sweet-scented cloak. I tried to be careful, but she knew that I was watching her. One night before we left, Rachel caught my eye, which was fixed upon her every move. At first she glared, but then she stared back in a way that told me I had triumphed. I could follow her. We went to the bama, where Zilpah was lying face down beside the altar, whispering to the gods and goddesses we were about to abandon. She looked up as we sat down among the roots of the great tree there. But I'm not even sure that Zilpah saw me sitting between Rachel's knees. As we waited, my aunt braided my hair and told me about the healing properties of common herbs. Coriander seeds for the bellyache, cumin for wounds. She had long ago decided that I should learn what Ina had taught her. We stayed there in the lap of the tree until Zilpah rose, sighed, and left. We sat until the sounds from the tents quieted and the last lamps were extinguished. We stayed until the moon, halfway to fullness, was high in the branches above us, and the only sound was the occasional bleating of a sheep. Then Rachel rose, and I followed as she walked softly to Laban's tent. My aunt made no acknowledgement of my presence, and I was not sure she knew I was behind her until she held the tent flap open for me, to a place I had never been nor wished to go. It was dark as a dry well in my grandfather's tent, and the air was fetid and stale. Rachel, who had been here to ply Kemuel with drink, walked past the snoring body directly to the corner of the tent, where a rough wooden bench served as Laban's altar. The teraphim were arrayed in 2 rows. Rachel reached out for them without hesitation and dropped them one by one into the cloth tied around her waist, as though she were harvesting onions. When the last of the idols fell into the apron, she turned, walked across the tent without a glance at Kemuel, who moaned in his sleep as she passed him, and soundlessly held the tent flap open for me. We walked out into the stillness. My heart pounded in my ears, and I drew a breath to rid myself of the tent stink. But Rachel did not pause. She walked quickly to her tent where Bila slept. I heard my aunt rustling among the blankets, but it was too dark to see where she hid the idols. When Rachel lay down and I heard nothing more, I wanted to shake her and demand that she show me the treasures. I wanted her to hug me and tell me how well I had done in keeping still, but I remained quiet. I lay down to the pounding of my heart, thinking that Kemuel would rush into the tent and kill us all. I wondered if the teraphim would come to life and cast terrible spells on us for disturbing them. I was sure that morning would never come, and I shivered into my blanket, though the night was not cold. Finally, my eyes closed to a dreamless sleep. I woke to a great noise of voices outside the tent. Rachel and Bela were already gone, and I was alone with 2 piles of neatly folded blankets. She had taken them with her, I realized. Rachel had moved the idols without me. After all of my careful watching and following, I had missed it. I rushed outside to see my brothers rolling up the goatskins that had been my father's tent. All around me, tents were going on the ground, the poles collected, the ropes coiled. My home had been dismantled. We were going. Jacob had risen at dawn and made a sacrifice of grain and wine and oil for the journey. The herds, sensing a change, were bleating and kicking up dust. The dogs would not stop barking. Half of the tents were down, leaving the camp looking lopsided and desolate, as though a great wind had blown away half of the world. We ate a morning meal salted with tears of those who would not accompany us. The women put away the last of the bowls and stood with empty hands. There was nothing left for us to do, but Jacob gave no sign for us to leave. Laban had not returned from Haran, as he had promised. The sun began to rise higher, and we should have been long gone, but Jacob stood alone at the top of the ridge that faced the road to Haran, squinting for a sign of Laban. Jacob's sons muttered among themselves. Zilpah walked to the bama, where she ripped her tunic and placed ashes on her hair. It grew hot and still, and even the herds quieted down. When Rachel walked past Reuben and Simon, Levi and Judah, who stood at the bottom of the hill where Jacob watched, and she approached her husband and said, "Let us go. Kemuel told me his father will remain with spears and riders and prevent us from leaving. He is going to tell the judges in Haran that you are a thief. We must not wait." Jacob listened and then replied, "Your father fears my God too much to act so boldly, and Kemuel is a fool." Rachel bowed her head and said, "My husband may know better, but the herds are ready and the goods are packed. Our feet are shod and we stand with nothing to do. We do not steal away in the dark of night. We take nothing but what is our own. The season is right. If we wait much longer, the moon will begin to wane, and a darkening moon is no time to embark upon a journey." Rachel spoke nothing but the truth, and Jacob had no wish to see Laban again. Indeed, he was furious with the old man for making him wait, for making him leave like a thief without giving proper farewell to the grandfather of his sons. Rachel's words spoke to Jacob's own purpose, and after she left him, he gave the order to go. Impatient to be underway, the sons of Jacob shouted with happiness, but a wail went up from the women who were staying behind. My father signaled us to follow him. He led us first to the bama, where each of us placed a pebble by the altar. The men picked up any small rock that lay at their feet to leave in farewell. Leah and Rachel sought out stones from around the foot of the nearby tree, terebinth, which had given them years of shade and comfort. No words were spoken. The stones would testify for us, though Bela kissed hers before laying it on top of the others. Zilpa and I alone were prepared for this moment. Weeks earlier, my grieving aunt had taken me to the wadi where Rudy had died and showed me a place at the bottom of the ravine filled with smooth, oval-shaped stones. She chose a tiny white one the size of her thumbnail. I took a red one, streaked with black, nearly as big as my fist. She kept it for me, and I placed it in my palm as we walked for the last time to the holy place of my family. When Jacob led his family over the hill to where the bondsman waited with the herd, my mother did not look back, not even Zilpa, whose eyes were red but dry. Thank you for joining us tonight. Please subscribe and like. Leave a comment. Tell us what you're liking, what you don't. If you have any book suggestions, we'd love to hear them. See you guys tomorrow. Happy sleeping.